Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Today will be our last video in our study of the leper-like beast of Revelation 13. We have identified this beast as the papacy, and in our last video we saw that the dragon that gave the papacy its power, its seat and great authority was the kingdom of Rome. So we want to pick up our study in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. Verse 2 concludes with the dragon giving him his power, his seat and authority. And then verse 5 reads, "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months." Here we are told the duration of the papacy's reign. Power was given him to continue 42 months, the Bible says. During this time we learn from verses 5 and 6 that he opens his mouth in blasphemy against God, and in verse 7 he is said to make war with the saints. And so this 42-month time period is very significant. So I would like for you to keep it in mind. We would revisit it shortly. But first we want to look into how the Bible quantifies time. The Bible lets us know that there are 12 months in a biblical year, similar to the calendars of today. 1 Kings tells us that Solomon had 12 officers and that each man had his own month in the year. So by this we can understand that a year had 12 months at the very least. In the time of Esther, beginning at the first month of the year, they casted the lot, and we are told that they did so from month to month, even to the 12th month. And so again, this points to a year having a minimum of 12 months. Lastly, we are told in 1 Chronicles chapter 27 that the captains that served the king served him month by month throughout all the months of the year. The fact that it states all the months of the year is very significant, because it then proceeds to mention these different captains, and they were 12 in number, establishing again that the year in biblical times also consisted of 12 months. So 42 months then, the time the papacy was said to reign, will amount to 3.5 years. It is 12 months per year. You divide 42 by 12, and so you would have 3.5. But remember, this is prophetic time, so that would be 3.5 prophetic years. Again, just keep that in mind because it will become very relevant as we continue on. The second thing we want to establish is the fact that a biblical month or prophetic month consisted of 30 days. In Genesis chapter 7, we have the account of the flood in Noah's time. And we read in verse 11 that the rain began to fall on the 17th day of the second month. And verse 24 lets us know that the waters continued for 150 days. So the rain started to fall on the 17th day of the second month and continued to fall for 150 days. In chapter 8 we then read in verse 3, "And the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days the waters were abated, and the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month." So the waters ceased on the 17th day of the 7th month. Right now, remember, it started on the 17th day of the second month and ended on the same day of the 7th month. So that gives us a total of 5 months to the very day. But we were already told that the waters lasted 150 days. And so that would mean that 5 months equals 150 days. And therefore, a singular month will have 30 days. 150 divided by 5. So with all of that in mind, let's return to the subject of our study. The papacy, we are told, would reign for 42 months, which we have seen is the equivalent of 3.5 years. But with what we have just learned, that a biblical month had 30 days, 42 months then would amount to 1,260 days. So this period of time, the 42 months, can also be denoted by 1,260 days. These numbers are all very significant, as we would see shortly. So keep them all in mind. 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, all different ways of expressing the same time period. So returning to Revelation chapter 13, the Bible describes what transpires during this time period in a very specific manner. In verse 5, we are told that the beast, that is the papacy, would have a mouth that speaks great things and blasphemies. And verse 7 says that he makes war with the saints of God and overcomes them. So again, remember these phrases: a mouth speaking great things, and he makes war with the saints of God and overcomes them, all of which takes place in this 42-month time period. So with that in mind, let's turn to Daniel chapter 7, Verse 7 introduces the fourth beast with 10 horns, which we have identified as the Roman Empire in our last video. Verse 24 tells us that these 10 horns represent 10 kings or kingdoms, and this is well documented in history. The Roman Empire, after the continual attacks of the barbarian tribes, was eventually divided into 10 independent kingdoms. These kingdoms were the Alemanni, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Suevi, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, the Lombards, the Heruli, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. These were the 10 divisions of Rome. But in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8, we read something very interesting. It says, "I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." Now this is very interesting. So out of the Roman Empire, after its division into 10 kingdoms, a little horn arises. This little horn removes 3 of the previous 10 kings in its ascent to power. But after removing these 3 horns, the Bible then describes this little horn as having a mouth speaking great things. Verse 19 then continues, "I would then know the truth of the fourth beast, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell. Even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them." Now notice that this little horn is spoken of in the exact manner as that of the beast of Revelation 13. It has a mouth speaking great things, it makes war with the saints, and prevails or overcomes them. And all of this over the same 42-month time period, as we would see shortly. By this we can understand that both the little horn of Daniel 7 and the beast of Revelation 13 refer to the same entity, and that is the papacy. But let's continue. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 23, it reads, "Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth." Verse 24 says, "And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and there shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and the dividing of time." Now a lot is said in these verses. Firstly, we read a repetition of what we just covered. The 10 horns of this fourth kingdom represent 10 kings or kingdoms, and points us to the division of Rome. After this, a little horn arises, and it removes 3 of the 10 horns that preceded it in its ascent to power. This history tells us that the papacy fulfills to the very letter. These 3 horns that the papacy removed were the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. The 7 remaining kingdoms became what we know now to be modern Europe. We then read in verse 25 that this little horn speaks great words against God. He wears out the saints, changes laws, and then we read that power was given him for a time, times, and dividing of time. Now you would remember in Revelation 13 it was said that power was given him 40 and 2 months. Now we are reading of this little horn, and power was given him for a time, times, and dividing of time. Now this is a very interesting phrase, time, times, and the dividing of time. It occurs in a number of instances in scripture, but what we would see is that it's actually another way of referencing the same 42-month period that we read of in Revelation 13. If you look up the word time in the Strong's Concordance, you would see that it is the Hebrew word edan, which means 1 year. So the phrase dividing of time, or half a time, would then be half a year. And times without a numerical value attached to it, like 3 times, 7 times, 9 times, etc. Times, when it appears in isolation, refers to 2 years. So in total, the phrase time, times, and dividing of time would amount to 3.5 years. Another way we can be certain of this is by comparing a few verses in Revelation chapter 12. In verse 14 we read of the woman, a symbol of the church, fleeing into the wilderness for a time and times and half a time. And that is how this period of time is described. But in verse 6 we read of the same period, but it is described differently. Notice verse 6 of Revelation 12. It says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, and they should feed her there 1,260 days." From this we learn that the phrase "a time, times, and half a time" totals or equals 1,260 days. Now we have already seen that 1,260 days is the day equivalent of 3.5 years. So if a time is 1 year, half a time will be half a year, then times will be the remaining 2 years. And so both the little horn of Daniel 7 and the beast of Revelation points us to the same entity making war with the saints of God for 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. All of those being different ways of denoting the same time period. Now I mentioned earlier that this is prophetic time. Both Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 are full of symbolic language, and the time periods associated with these must also be regarded as such. It is prophetic time. The Bible in earlier portions of its writings has already established a principle when dealing with prophetic time, and so it is not repeated in the book of Daniel. But it teaches that when speaking in a prophetic context, a day equals 1 year. Notice Numbers chapter 14, verse 33, it says, "And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years. Verse 34 continues, "After the number of the days in which you search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year." And Ezekiel chapter 4 repeats that thought. It says in verse 5, "For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days." And verse 6 concludes by saying, "I have appointed thee each day for a year." And so a day in prophecy accounts for 1 year. That would mean that the prophetic period over which the papacy is set to reign, that 42-month, 1,260-day time period, is actually 1,260 years. And this is precisely what is seen in history after the removal of the Ostrogoths, the third and the last horn, in the year 538 AD. The papacy was then unobstructed to occupy the throne of the earth, and it stayed there for 1,260 years. And so papal supremacy continued until the year 1798, where it received a deadly wound, exactly 1,260 years from the year it began to reign. We read in Revelation 13 that John saw one of the beast's heads as it were wounded to death. And in verse 10 it says, "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword." Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. And so in the year 1798, the French army entered Rome and made the Pope a prisoner, and he eventually died in exile. A new Pope was afterward elected, but the papal hierarchy there lost the civil authority that it possessed before. This separation of civil power from the papacy's churchcraft is what constituted its deadly wound. But the Bible states clearly that this deadly wound will be healed. The papacy will once more attain the civil power and authority that it lost, and it will again occupy the throne of the earth. We are told in Revelation chapter 17 that the kings of the earth will have one mind at the end of time, and give their power and strength to the papacy once again, thereby healing its wound. And if we look around closely at the events and the things that are taking place in our world, we will see that these things are already beginning to take place.